and we are delighted to have today at our 9th Annual China Defense and Security Conference the Honorable Randall Schriver, who's Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific Security Affairs. Mr. Schriver was appointed to this position on January 8th, 2018. For those of you who don't know anything about Jamestown, we are a nonprofit foundation in Washington that deals and specializes in Eurasia with terrorism and also deal a lot with China. And we appreciate the people, this program or discussion today is going to be broadcast on C-SPAN. So we're very excited about getting the visibility throughout the United States. And the critical importance of this speech is that Randall Schriver's speech today, his comments are on the record. He appeared last year at the Jamestown Foundation China Defense and Security Conference. His comments were off the record at that time. So this year we keep progressing in how we're advancing with Secretary Schriver, and we're trying to get more attention to this issue. But let me first of all say that a couple words about Randy. He has long been known in the China community as a robust voice on China, leading strategic thinker on Asia. In 2008, he co-founded the Project 2049 with Mark Stokes. He's been very active in this region for quite a long time and has a wide and distinguished career. We're starting off with the consulting firm Armitage International, and he's gone on to different areas. Of course, he's the CEO and president of Project 2049, a nonprofit research organization dedicated to security trends lines in Asia. He's also served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. He was responsible for China, Taiwan, Mongolia, Hong Kong, Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific Islands. Many of you have the bio for him. I think that one of the things that he has done in terms of being a robust thinker is, and I think he's very proud of this, and he has every right to be, is that in June 2019, he helped develop the long-term, in order to deal with China as a long-term strategic competitor, he created a new position in the Department of Defense called the new Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for China. And that has been a very important development because it's really kind of helped focus and synthesize the thinking in the Pentagon on China. And we're delighted that Randy has once again taken the time to come and talk to us. So without further ado, I turn the floor over to Randy. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Glenn. Really appreciate the opportunity to be back. I guess this is progression being on the record, but I welcome the opportunity to have this discussion in public because I think it's a very important and consequential time in the region and what we're trying to do to compete effectively with China. So I appreciate being here on the record and being part of this discussion. And congratulations on all the work that Jamestown Foundation continues to do, including this conference. I was able to stream some of the discussion earlier and saw some old friends like Russell and helping us to get our hands around these various challenges, and particularly enjoyed the discussion, or maybe I should say learned from the discussion on influence operations and how aggressive China, and John's comments on that. So I'm very pleased to be part of this discussion. I thought I would just talk a little bit about some recent developments, some recent travels that I had, and then embed that in our strategy that we're implementing, and then leave some time for discussion, questions and answers. And I will talk a little bit about internally how we're organizing for this challenge, as Glenn mentioned, the creation of this new position. So I am just back from the region. I was last week in China, Vietnam, and Japan. And trust me, that is the right order to take that trip. A strategic competitor, an emerging partner, and end with a close, rock-solid ally. But I certainly learned that a lot of the trends that we've been tracking and observing are unfolding. I think the Chinese did receive me at the normal protocol level, and we did have a discussion about our defense relationship. They continue to say to us that they want the military relationship to be a stabilizing force in the overall relationship. And of course, that overall relationship is facing a number of stresses, trade issues, and concerns about what's happening internally in China and what's happening in Hong Kong. But we continue to hear from them that they want the relationship to be a stabilizing factor. We're trying to better understand what they mean by that, but at a minimum, they seem to want to continue the high-level engagement, which we welcome. We want good channels of communication. We want the ability to talk about our intentions, our policies, hear from them about their own, but also try to advance our agenda that we're working on with respect to risk reduction, trying to make the operating environment safer so we can avoid unintended incidents or accidents, and that we can still try to work on issues where our interests may align, to include the challenges we're facing with respect to North Korea and the Korean Peninsula. So we had a chance to talk through those things and understand better where the Chinese are on this. But I think what we also observed, particularly as the trip continued into places like Vietnam and Japan, that although there's some rebranding underway, the CCP is trying to put a better face on the One Belt, One Road initiative. They're maybe not highlighting as much some of the activities in the East China Sea and South China Sea. But certainly what we see in the rest of the region is while the branding effort might be underway, the behavior and the activities are still quite robust and of concern to us. In Vietnam, for example, the incursions into the Vietnamese EEZ and putting pressure on not only the Vietnamese but other international private companies that would do legal exploration and extracting. In Japan, they talk about an improving relationship, and they're focused on a possible Xi Jinping visit to Japan next year, but in fact, the same level of activities occurring in and around the Senkaku Islands and in the East China Sea, the same naval and maritime militia and Coast Guard activities into Japanese territorial waters, or what they regard as territorial waters. So I think the rebranding is underway, but the activities are still, and the behavior is still of concern to us. And it's really of concern because it's embedded in what we understand to be long-term Chinese strategic ambitions and aspirations. And when we talk about competition and why we believe we're on the leading edge of long-term strategic competition, it's really based on those different visions and aspirations, right? We talk about a free and open Indo-Pacific, and although that sounds like a slogan and can become a mantra as we keep saying it, it's really important to remember that it's founded on enduring and widely shared, if not universal, principles: respect for sovereignty, support for international law and international norms, support for peaceful resolution of disputes, fair, open, and reciprocal trade. That's what we mean when we talk about a free and open Indo-Pacific. And again, we see the Chinese and the CCP with a different vision. Sometimes we talk about the Chinese being opaque and difficult to understand and enigmatic. And at Project 2049, as Glenn mentioned, we had a very sophisticated methodology at trying to understand the CCP, and I'm going to share it with you. It's our intellectual property, but I'll share it with you. We listen to what they say, read what they write, and watch what they do. And if you do those things, you'll start to see very clearly a different vision for the future security architecture for the Indo-Pacific region, and one that could be a threat to those underlying principles that I spoke of, the respect for sovereignty and international law and international norms. So when we talk about competition, it is a competition of different visions, but it's also our belief that we need to maintain an edge, to include in the military domain, in order to promote and sustain the concept of a free and open Indo-Pacific, along with so many other countries that share that same vision and those same aspirations. We sometimes hear from countries they don't want to choose. They don't want to choose between the United States and China. We say, we're not asking you to choose between our countries, choose between Washington and Beijing, but if you can support protection of your own sovereignty, if you can support international law and norms, then we're confident you'll be with us, because that's all we seek. We seek strong and independent and prosperous partners like Vietnam and Japan, not an erosion of those things that countries value so much. So as I said, our competition with China is embedded in this regional strategy. We released in June 2019 at the Shangri-La Dialogue our Indo-Pacific Strategy Report. And we talked about the strategy being based on the 3 Ps. We have our own branding, right? You got to make it memorable. So we have the 3 Ps: preparedness, partnerships and allies, and promoting a networked region. We had to work a little harder for the 3rd P, but it's there. So preparedness, that's about increasing the lethality of the joint force. So if you look at our budgets, particularly the last budget, and I can tell you the one that will come after that in the next fiscal year, you'll see a shift in resource allocation. You'll see more investment into the types of things such as hypersonics, cyber, space, the kinds of things we need to maintain that edge I spoke about with respect to China. So when we talk about increasing the lethality of the joint force, we're very clear that China's modernization is a pacing threat for us, along with Russia and other strategic competitors, but it's really China that's the pacing element for us. The second P, partners and allies, we invest a lot of time in these relationships. For us, it's absolutely critical. The United States is, of course, a Pacific nation. I know that, having been born in Hawaii and raised in Oregon and looked Pacific my whole life. But for some people, you need a little reminding that we are a Pacific nation, but we're not a resident Asia-Pacific nation. Even as far as Guam stretches or the Aleutian Island chain in Alaska or other U.S. territories, American Samoa, we're still not fully resident in Asia. So we're very reliant on partners and allies for their own capabilities that they can bring to bear with respect to this emerging China challenge. We want more capable partners to look after their own sovereignty, deal with these security challenges, and contribute. But we're also very dependent on partners and allies for basing, for presence, for access opportunities. And so as we develop these partners and allies, all these things are in our thinking. So we work with very mature allies like Japan, and we look at how our national defense strategy and their national defense program guidelines align and what it means to implement and operationalize those strategies and what that means to promote the free and open Indo-Pacific. And we also look at emerging partners, as I mentioned, countries like Vietnam, but also beyond that, Indonesia, Malaysia, further to the west in the Indo-Pacific, India, and what it means not to be an ally, because many of these countries jealously guard their non-aligned status, but to be a partner in promoting these principles, giving us the opportunities for training and potential access opportunities down the road. Because if you look at what it means to maintain an edge against China and have confidence that you could prevail in contingencies, ultimately it does involve dispersal, diversification opportunities, and so part of our relationships are certainly oriented towards creating those opportunities for us. The third P, promoting a networked region, is a recognition that the security challenges in the Indo-Pacific are inherently multilateral challenges, or increasingly multilateral challenges, maybe is a better way to put it. When you think about protecting your 12 nautical miles of sovereign territory into your territorial waters, when you think about protecting your EEZ, it's really about domain awareness, right? Maritime domain awareness and maritime security. That doesn't start or stop at 200 nautical miles. In fact, you need queuing, you need information, and you need to be able to contribute the same to others who have a similar interest in protecting their own areas. So maritime domain awareness and maritime security, we think about how countries can move along a particular spectrum, seeing, sensing, sharing, and contributing. So seeing, as it sounds, is just the most fundamental element of knowing what's approaching or in your territorial waters or EEZs. Sensing is beyond just seeing, knowing something about it. What kind of vessel or element are you dealing with? Sharing means you've got to be networked, right? So you have to be able to have the ability to pass data and communicate information. And then contributing, being in a position to actually respond with some capability, whether it's a Coast Guard cutter or aircraft or whatever it may be. So moving countries along that spectrum, we believe, will get us to a point where the the region is sufficiently networked to deal with the emerging security challenges. As I said, they are increasingly multilateral in nature, whether that's actual incursions from naval vessels, whether that's drug trafficking, whether that's illicit human trafficking. These are all challenges that benefit from a more networked region, so we work on that. We still maintain those ties with China, as I mentioned. We do believe that it's important to keep the channels of communication open. We're glad to have a willing partner to continue the dialogue, but we want more from our Chinese counterparts. We want a more advanced dialogue on intentions and visions for the future regional security architecture, and we particularly want more in terms of contributing on the real-world problems where we think our interests do have alignment. And I mentioned the Korean Peninsula. We're at a particular juncture there where we've made an attempt to restart diplomacy with the meeting that Steve Biegun and his team had in Sweden. We'll see where that goes, but in the meantime, we've been doing our part to try to maintain pressure on Pyongyang through the enforcement of sanctions so that they will come to the table with a particular mindset where they want to be productive, where they want to reach solutions with us. And we think that it's critical that all countries who have the capability to contribute to that do so. And what we're seeing from China right now, unfortunately, is some slippage in the enforcement of the sanctions, particularly when it comes to ship-to-ship transfers happening in their territorial waters. And so we want them and need them to do better on that front. So as we compete, and by the way, we say competitor, we don't say adversary, we don't say enemy. That's an important distinction for Americans because competition can be done in a way that is benign and doesn't lead to conflict, and in fact can bring out the better in both parties if it's done the right way. But while we compete, we want to do so at a minimum safely and not spiral the relationship in a downward direction that would be dangerous for all parties concerned. So that's our basic framework, and as I said, we're well into the implementation phase of that. To do that more effectively, as was mentioned, we have created a new DASD ship. For those of you who may not know, all the alphabet soup of the Pentagon. So underneath myself, the Assistant Secretary, I now have 4 Deputy Assistant Secretaries of Defense. And the fourth that was created, as Glenn said, is the DASD for China. It's a bit of a misnomer. It's really for the China competition or the China challenge because it goes beyond just the bilateral interactions with the PLA. It's an office that will have separate directorates under it that will deal with different parts of the defense enterprise and seek alignment within our department for the China challenge. It's one thing to have a great strategy document, it's another to have great policy statements, but it's quite another to bring the whole enterprise of the Department of Defense into alignment for the challenge. So we'll have directorates that deal with the other regions. So we'll have somebody on the China DASD, China desk that deals with Africa. We'll have somebody who deals with Western Hemisphere. We'll have somebody who deals with Middle East and Europe and Russia and actually will help our department work on those issues rather than having to integrate at a very senior level. We'll have people under the DASD for China who deal with strategy and plans, so that won't be the sole purview of just the strategists and the planners. We'll have people who understand China and are involved in China policy informing that process in a better way. We'll have people who deal with what we call ec and tech, the economic and technology issues under the China DASD ship. So everything from the 5G challenges, protection of the innovation base in the United States, understanding China's own efforts at acquiring technology and modernizing themselves better. That will all be under our China DASD ship to, we think, put us in a better position to compete well, compete effectively, and do so in a safe way. So with that, I may pause and see if that is enough to spur some discussion, some questions, some criticisms, comments, whatever may be on your mind. So thank you, Glenn.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Randy. As I mentioned earlier in our previous discussion beforehand, I wanted to ask you about what is the Pentagon thinking about China and the Arctic, if you could address that.
Well, we put out an annual report at the Pentagon called the PLA Military Power Report, and every year we select a special topic or two to include as new annexes, special annexes. And this year we did include an annex on China and the Arctic. I would say at this point we're more in the observation phase and trying to better understand phase. We see certainly a lot of interest on the part of the Chinese joining the Arctic Council as as an observer. Their own stated policy of the, is it the Arctic Silk Road, or they put Silk Road behind just about everything now, or belt or road, but near Arctic state. They've declared themselves a near Arctic state. The heavy investment in icebreakers. So there's clearly some ambition there, and I think we're trying to understand the full spectrum of what's driving that ambition. It's maybe resource interests. It may be new routes for commerce, and it may very well be military in terms of what's a driver. And those, of course, aren't mutually exclusive, but we're of particular interest in what the military dimensions might be. And it could be taking a page out of the Soviet model, how they've used sort of remote areas for positioning certain assets, sort of a bastion strategy. So we're watching and learning about that. We're, of course, an Arctic Council member ourselves and very interested in what unfolds there. And we're open to a discussion with China about it, but what we mostly find is discussion with other Arctic states that are interested and somewhat concerned about China's behavior.
Thank you. Well, on that note, we'll open the floor to some questions. Mr. Mulvannon, please identify yourself. Some don't know who you are. So.
Hi, Brendan Mulvaney from the Air Force's China Aerospace Studies Institute. Sir, you started off talking about senior level, obviously yourself, going to meet with your counterparts, and then you mentioned kind of the practical, hey, let's not run into each other on the high seas or in the air. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about kind of that middle, either you could call it a 1.5, something like the Shangshan Forum, and then maybe working level visits between the United States and specifically the PLA, but anybody in the PRC, and what, if anything, the department is doing to either promote or to curtail some of those activities.
I don't think we're doing a lot to curtail. I mean, we've made some decisions because of Chinese policies and behavior. We made the decision that I think we talked about last year in this very forum to disinvite Chinese from RIMPAC because of their militarization of the South China Sea. I don't know how you ignore when the president, or in this case the general secretary of the Communist Party, comes to the White House, goes to the Rose Garden and says they won't militarize, and then they do it. There's got to be some consequence for that. But for the most part, we're interested in a variety of levels of contact, types of engagement, if it can promote our interests. We try to have an interest-based approach. We don't engage for engagement's sake. Our metric is not volume, number of visits, or how much engagement we have. It's, are we promoting our interests, developing a better understanding of the PLA, promoting an openness and transparency. And by the way, I thought the release of their white paper, we can critique it as to the quality, but I thought the release of the white paper was a good move in terms of being transparent, and coming to brief it in Washington was a good move. We welcome that. But other objectives in terms of promoting a safe operating environment and trying to develop better relationships with the next generation and future officer corps. All these things get worked in to a proposal for an annual military contact plan, and then we sort of work through with the Chinese what's acceptable. I would say anything that we think can push us toward achieving our objectives, we're open to. We're not sort of saying this level or that level is out of bounds. But again, we don't just want engagement for engagement's sake, and I think there are past eras where that was a metric, and frankly, it's been a metric in other relationships, so it's something that sort of gets transported into the China field. But it's just, we're trying to tighten things up and have things that truly do advance our interests and are meaningful.
Jia Cheng with United News Group. The previous speaker, Deputy Director General Vincent Chen, mentioned that U.S. and Taiwan may consider to sign a joint MOU to combat disinformation. Will U.S. be willing to do so? And the second question is, when you were in China, did you talk about the Taiwan issue, and how did the Chinese respond? Thank you.
Well, you may not be surprised. I didn't have to bring up the Taiwan issue when it was raised. it was not long after, for example, our decision to make available the F-16s, so it was on their minds. I simply reiterated that our policy remains the same related to the implementation of the Taiwan Relations Act. They're not seeing new things. What they're seeing is an implementation based on their own trajectory, their own modernization, the threat that they're creating. And so, of course, we're going to continue to honor the law and provide systems that are needed for Taiwan's self-defense. I don't want to comment on any future agreements we may have. I do think this is an area where we both share some concerns and would benefit from understanding best practices. And we know that this is an issue of concern related to the upcoming Taiwan election. We'll have our own election shortly following that. So I think we need to engage on this and again learn from one another best practices. But I don't want to comment on any possible future agreements.
Identify yourself.
Sure, Byron Callen, Capital Alpha Partners. For the new DASD, are you bringing in more people? Are you bringing people from the outside, or are you just moving billets around within the Department of Defense or pulling from other agencies? Thank you.
A little bit of both, and we have a $750 billion budget, but we still are resource constrained. So we're doing our best to build that team out, and it will be a combination of all of that. The good news from our perspective is the Secretary of Defense, the Deputy, the Undersecretary are not only behind this initiative and the creation of this office. In fact, it wouldn't have been possible had they not approved it. But the notion that this is needed to drive the alignment to compete more effectively, they're 100% behind. So we're getting a lot of support we need to build that out in all the ways you talked about.
Thank you. Juliet from Sound of Hope Radio Network. We have been broadcasting and censored news to China about the cyber security, national security from China. We all know Huawei, Tengxun, WeChat, they are all unsecure. But recently, we also heard Apple Safari browser will send customers' info to Tengxun. And Tengxun have been spoon-feeding the information from customer to police system, Chinese police system. We know, so in your view, how to avoid those unsecure things happen? Thank you.
Well, I think it requires a degree of vigilance and understanding the environment, understanding the relationship between these companies and the CCP, and having a full accounting for where the vulnerabilities may be. I think from the United States, the awareness piece is there now. The effort to better understand, go through our networks, go through supply chains, things of that nature to understand where the vulnerabilities are. That's, well underway and I think advanced. Where it gets more challenging is with partners and allies and others, because for a variety of reasons. One is, the education piece and the awareness piece. That's come along. And maybe not where it needs to be everywhere, but countries are either learning themselves or in some cases ahead of us. I think Australia has been well aware of these challenges for quite some time and made some bold decisions. But as others come along, the other issue is we need to sort of meet them where they are, right? I mean, some countries are heavily invested in Huawei, 4G, and it's part of their networks and infrastructure. So understanding how they can advance and get to where they want to be in terms of their modernization goals and deal with the cost of, if you're having to rip out an entire existing infrastructure versus just sort of adding on incrementally, that's a huge difference. That's a huge undertaking. So meeting countries where they are and working with them in terms of themselves having secure networks. Because what we don't want is for these decisions, commercial decisions, to become inhibitors in how we can share information and intelligence with allies and partners. They may make those decisions anyways, and then we may have to respond accordingly in terms of how we deal with those countries. So I think it's all those things. It's the education, awareness, understanding vulnerabilities, making economic decisions based on where countries are, and then adapting from there.
Thank you very much. Mark Manier with the South China Morning Post. Mr. Schriver, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about Hong Kong. What are the options that the U.S. has if Beijing adopts a more forceful approach? And how do you see the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act? That's been seen or characterized by some as playing into Beijing's black hand scenario, by others as a much needed support for the demonstrators, and sort of everything in between. And not only that, but sometimes seen if you do take some serious action with the Hong Kong Policy Act, that is a rather blunt instrument that could hurt the Hong Kong people more. Thank you.
Well, it turns out you don't have to do a lot to be accused of being the black hand behind some of this stuff. So I don't think that can't be our sort of guiding principle, is how we avoid that label, because we seem to be stuck with it just by virtue of who we are. We believe in free speech, we believe in human rights, and so that makes us, I think, suspicious to the CCP authorities. Look, I think we as a administration have said all along our hope is that this is resolved in a way that avoids violence and chaos, and that the authorities are able to deal with those who have legitimate grievances and are merely asking for respect for their rights that are guaranteed under the basic law, that are guaranteed under the 1984 Joint Declaration. President Trump, in fact, you may have noticed in his UN speech, did mention the 1984 UK-China Joint Declaration, and that we view that as binding, as does the international community that cares about rule of law, and that those fundamental rights should be respected and guaranteed. So I think for those that have those aspirations and are speaking out merely for respect for those rights, we're 100% behind. And believe that the authorities should accommodate based on previous promises made, both political promises, but also enshrined in those documents. Certainly we have some concern about some of the tactics that the protesters have been using and may use, and I think in single instances where that becomes a real problem, we would point that out. But I think in general, we're concerned about the heavier hand that Beijing has taken and the Hong Kong authorities have taken with what we regard as legitimate activities on the part of the people of Hong Kong. I don't know that we've taken a position on legislation, so I'll not speak directly to that, other than those fundamental principles we believe should be supported.
Is there a limit to, I won't use the word red line, but is there a limit to how much heavy-handedness in Hong Kong can truly disturb the United States? We've talked about this internally, and I think we regard let me say by historic standards, we regard the Hong Kong police and the authorities there as a very professional force, and have historically acted in accordance with upholding law, and there's a very good judicial system historically. What we're concerned about is the heavier hand from Beijing and how that can be distorted and turned into something more repressive. It'd almost have to be sort of case by case if there were to be an incident of some sort, judging based on the merits of an individual case. But I think the general
trend is concerning, that we're seeing, you know, less autonomy, more influence from Beijing, heavier hand from the authorities there, and in general, an erosion of the things that were promised the people of Hong Kong in the Joint Declaration and in the Basic Law.
Thank you. Let's go to this side of the room, and then we'll come back over here, and then to you, Russell. So we have about 10 more minutes.
Thank you, Assistant Secretary Schriver, very much. I'm Ben Lowson from Air Force Checkmate. My question for you is, earlier this year, you talked about China's concentration camps in the West, which I think some people would say, oh, maybe that's not quite a defense issue. And so I really appreciated you talking about that. And would you comment on balancing carrying out an interests-based policy in our nation, which is arguably a values-based nation? Thank you.
Well, let me be clear. I do think it's a defense issue and a security issue. First of all, I think it's indicative of how this regime will behave and what tolerance it has for very aggressive, outrageous behavior. Tells you something about the CCP. That could easily translate into external behavior as well. But I think it goes far beyond that, right? What we have is the potential radicalization of a population that historically is not actually particularly radical. I mean, we did designate a group in 2002, ETEM, which basically doesn't exist anymore, other than in Chinese propaganda and Chinese accusations of everybody who wants freedom in Xinjiang is ETEM, right? But what they're doing is potentially radicalizing a population that was, by historic measure, pretty peaceful, and could create terrorist problems and could create networking that even spills outside of China. We know that there have been Uyghurs who have been involved in organizations outside the borders of China. Part of that is training and information to try to take back into China, but part of it is actual contributions to other fights. And so what we see is these activities can spill over into the broader terrorist problem and radicalization problem. There's also the issue of, and this again, why is this a defense or a security issue? What's being created there in terms of the tools of repression, the technology, is exportable, and they're in fact exporting it to other like-minded regimes, authoritarian regimes who want to exercise similar control over their populations. So things that we're concerned about in Xinjiang all of a sudden then can become things we're concerned about more broadly in the region. And there's the potential for the development of a pretty toxic mix when you have return of foreign fighters from the Middle East, when you have the Rohingya problem spilling over largely in Bangladesh now, but they're having trouble containing that as I think great as their efforts have been. A disaffected population there that has no place to return to because the Burmese have done nothing to make the Rakhine state a welcoming environment for their return. And now add the largely Uyghurs in Xinjiang. This is a pretty dangerous mix of disaffection and potential for mischief or well beyond that, potential for violence. So we are concerned at the Defense Department about these activities in Western China, and we'll continue to speak out about it.
John Hanovich, IPVM. Could you talk a little bit about the Department of Defense's concerns about cybersecurity as it relates to PRC? Last year in the NDAA, there was a ban for Huawei, Hikvision, and Dahua. So is the Department of Defense concerned about companies and organizations that might have influence by the PRC government?
Yeah, again, we're concerned given the nature of the relationship that these Chinese companies have with the CCP and the influence that the CCP may have on their decision making and how they may be involved in state-sponsored goals such as theft of technology, intelligence, et cetera. So our first concern is the vulnerabilities that can be created by dealing with these companies, using their technologies, et cetera. The concerns in the cyber realm, of course, go beyond that, because we see that the Chinese are investing in cyber not just for the purpose of intellectual property theft, technology, and helping their own technological innovation base, but integrating it into military plans and contingency plans. And so understanding better how the Chinese may use cyber in their own future warfight is a growing interest and concern of ours. And if you look at our cyber strategy report that the Department of Defense put out, it addresses sort of both sides of those equations, the vulnerability and protection side as well as the warfighting side. And as I said in the previous comment, if you really want to understand Pillar 1 of the National Defense Strategy, Pillar 1 of our Indo-Pacific strategy, increasing the lethality of our force, look at where we're going to make investments for the future, where we're doing research and development, but where we're trying to acquire capabilities as quickly as we can. And cyber is at the top of that list. Once we acquire the greater capability, it also, ourselves, we need to think about how it integrates into contingency planning. The other thing our cyber strategy points out is we do need to think about classic deterrence and how we can use certain capabilities to give the Chinese pause in terms of their own use of cyber.
Mr. Secretary, Randy, thank you very much for your excellent presentation. In your remarks, you mentioned the importance of the U.S. working with our allies and partners to really realize the free and open Indo-Pacific. I was wondering if you can speak to how you see Japan and Taiwan possibly working closer together in realizing this free and open Indo-Pacific, and basis on actually a recent event that was held by the Project 2049 Institute on this very topic of exploring different avenues of cooperation. And I was wondering if this is a subject matter that the DoD and you are thinking about.
So I think as individual partners, we have ongoing work to try to promote those respective bilateral relationships and how they can contribute to promoting the free and open Indo-Pacific. As I said, Japan has the National Defense Program guidelines. We have our National Defense Strategy, and we're doing a lot of work to go beyond recognizing strategic alignment and thinking about operationalizing that. So talking about roles and missions and how we can further and advance that. And it really does support Prime Minister Abe's own vision for being more proactive in the region and be a proactive participant and a constructive participant in promoting regional security. There's some debate over where that term comes from, free and open Indo-Pacific, and I know our Japanese friends would say it was actually Japan and Prime Minister Abe, and I won't dispute that, but we think we've got a very strong, reliable, interested partner in Japan in promoting those principles. With Taiwan, I think, again, we see a lot of alignment, a very like-minded partner. Taiwan is facing a very real, immediate threat from China, and it comes in a variety of ways, forms, the diplomatic pressure, the economic, use of economic coercion, the military pressure through more robust exercising and training that is clearly designed to intimidate Taiwan. So Taiwan's primary role in promoting a free and open Indo-Pacific is really protecting itself and ensuring that a democratic people can preserve their status, preserve their ability to decide the future for themselves, and then beyond that, think about ways to contribute to those principles in the region. Taiwan is constrained because of its diplomatic status, but we do find Taiwan still finds voice in promoting those things where it can. And in terms of the trilateral, I would just say there are things that happen quietly a lot. We do try to leverage what's happening in the think tank world and the Track 2 world because there are a lot of good ideas being incubated there. The stuff that's happening behind the scenes, I probably wouldn't want to go into great detail about, but I think we're finding that to be potentially very fruitful as well.
Question.
Hi, Liz Kim from Voice of America Korean Service, Assistant Secretary. A few months ago, Washington Post reported that Huawei allegedly helped North Korea building its own network. Do you see that as a security issue as well?
Well, I don't want to comment on any particular intelligence report. I think, more broadly speaking, the Chinese can claim a lot of responsibility for North Korea, what would pass for modernization, certainly on the military side, but also in the commercial sector, private sector, infrastructure. Those relationships are there, and the Chinese have become the most important partner for North Korea. And we want them to do better, as I said, at a minimum, sanctions enforcement, but I think there are other ways that China could help pressure Pyongyang into being a more constructive participant in these talks should they resume, and we're just not seeing it right now.
First of all, I'd like to thank very much Secretary Schriver for taking time out of his day and coming to spend about an hour with us. So we're thanking everyone in C-SPAN who's watching this. We're now going to break for a few minutes, but please let's give Secretary Schriver a big round of applause and thank him.